Hi, and welcome to the second session of the concept of acceleration with Nick Land. And pass the mic off to him right now.
Thanks, Theodore. And I'm sorry for having been so utterly humiliated by Pacific Daylight Saving Time. I sort of understood, and then I managed to just get myself screwed up about it again. So I'm sorry that you've all been kept hanging around. So this week I want to base things around the manifesto for accelerationist politics and use it as a jump off. I hope that I can. It's obviously a text that in some sense I'm more averse to than any other in existence, but I think it's an extremely rich text, and there's all kinds of interesting material in it, and not just, I don't mean that just in terms of bits and pieces, but I mean in terms of structural factors that are extremely stimulating. I've attempted to divide my sort of comments into four broad sections, which roughly go under the labels critique, neoliberalism, agency, and what I'll call templexity. I know that's a horrible neologism that will need a bit more explanation. It would obviously be nice to keep them in order, but as we see, that turns out to be complicated. So I'll try roughly to follow that series and not hog the thing for too long, but try and treat this as a way of opening things up. So I think a close reading of the text would actually overspill our time here. So we'll sort of dip in and out of it, and obviously anything that people find there is completely on topic for this week especially, but I think more generally. So let me just start first of all with a few very elementary remarks, and I apologize to people if this is repetitive, because I'm sure some of this is stuff I've talked about before. But I think one of the frames for this discussion is the relationship between capitalism and critique. Taking, therefore, the critique of political economy in a strictly Kantian sense as a delimitation of metaphysics. And this subdivides into, in a complicated way, not a neat way, because these elements are all enter into various relations of antagonism with each other and mutual interference, but it subdivides into three sections, I think. And the first of these is Marx's own argument, as a critical argument, which, taking a step back to what Kant is doing in the most absolutely schematic way, is drawing transcendental empirical difference and saying that metaphysics consists of treating a transcendental structure as if it's an empirical object. So on that level, it's I think this is an anchor point that can be confidently held onto. All kinds of difficulties emerge from that, and they're not just difficulties at a conceptual level, but they're difficulties that have a kind of deep propelling historical force, and a lot of the things that happen to critique involve materializing it, and therefore seeing these difficulties and complexities and forms of turbulence as actual historical processes, not merely philosophical difficulties. Marx's argument, constructed as critique in the Kantian sense, draws transcendental empirical difference in his distinction between labor and labor power. So labor power is transcendental for Marx. It's the fundamental source of all productivity. And capitalism, as he grasps it critically, is a system in which it is a metaphysical system in the strict sense that that transcendental power is formatted as if it were an object. And that formatting as an object, commoditization, and obviously in particular the central nexus of his whole theoretical endeavor, the objectification of labor as a commodity. And this is the kind of Marxist understanding of the wage labor system understood in its philosophical structure. So I'm not going to, we can obviously return to this if people are interested, but I want to just simply say at this level that this is one of the basic articulations of the capitalism and critique relation, is the fact that Marx's analysis of capital takes this particular critical form. And this is repeated in a displaced way in Anti-Oedipus, with their notion of the distinction between schizophrenia as a historical process of decoding and deterritorialization versus schizophrenia as clinical entity, as an object. So that's just a strict philosophical displacement of exactly the same theoretical structure that is taking place there. So that's the first capital critique articulation, and it's obviously relevant in the sense that the default is to assume that is implicit in the position of the MAP, and so the question of exactly to what extent they remain faithful to what Marx is doing there, or they want to in various ways modulate it, is obviously one of the would naturally bring to that text. The second articulation of capitalism critique, which directly interferes with this Marxist sense of it, is the function of capital itself as a critique. And I think this is most kind of simply or straightforwardly understood in terms of abstract capital, or capitalism itself being synonymous with the emergence of abstract capital, which is critically separated from its concrete instances. That's to say that any particular configuration of capital is subject to this critical destabilization by this emergence of increasingly abstracted capital, which is only inadequately objectified by any particular configuration of capitalist organization. So already I think in this, the implicit question that is haunting the MAP is the extent to which capital itself, or the left critique of capital, is able with greater profundity and practical efficacy to actually undertake the critique of concrete capital. And I think that this is very much already in play in the kind of accelerationist Marxist canon, starting with the Communist Manifesto itself. This spectre, quite another spectre to the famous spectre of that text, but the spectre abstract, creative, destructive capital that is able more profoundly to revolutionize itself than any external revolutionary force is able to destabilize it at a greater speed. I mean, it becomes immediately a question of speed and acceleration. And I think there's lots that could be said here. Again, I don't want to get sucked in too much. I think that again, on topics that in previous courses we've discussed, but we can certainly return to, the structure of the internet has a critical structure in terms of the elimination of privileged nodes. The whole notion of network decentralization has a critical structure in terms of not identifying the system as a whole with any node within in the system. So any particular node that serves as an inadequate objectification of the system is subject to this kind of decentralized process of critique by the system through root arounds, going all the way back to and radicalizing the notion of roundabout production that you get in Bauak. The force of when this is looked at in a kind of down-to-earth economic argument, it's the process of disintermediation. And the elimination of trusted third parties is the way it's carried forward into the Bitcoin system. So I think there's an anarcho-capitalist, or what's called critically the Californian ideology, that is this very insistently reproduced critical dynamic intrinsic to capital itself, as opposed to something that's brought to it from outside as a critique of the left. And I think the final thing to definitely mention here is platforms, which is something that comes in a little bit elusively in MAP, but platform capitalism is obviously a big interest to the authors of the piece, and they articulate their project as in terms of repurposing certain large platform structures of contemporary capital. And obviously a platform is something that is itself a displacement of transcendental empirical difference. It basically divides a system from particular instances, traffic within that system. And I think I'm going to just pass you on a link, which I think is really good, captures this very well, by Eli Dorado, where he said, the title of the piece, "Bitcoin isn't money, it's the internet of money." Eli Dorado describes himself as an economist working on accelerating the pace of technological change. And this, just in the title, it's clear, I think, that there's a kind of a displaced transcendental empirical difference doing the important philosophical work in this piece. So I'll try and just move on from this. It's something that I'm expecting. These issues are obviously going to be with us to the end of the course, so it's not a question of trying to conclude anything at this stage. I think it's worth another instance that's just worth throwing in at this point is the very famous quote from Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, where he advises, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. And this too, I think, has a very clear critical sense to it, which is the sense that strategically, conflictually, the strategic goal is to make your enemy the object. You know, there's the philosophical question of how to locate the transcendental and empirical instances in the topic at hand has this immediate strategic sense to it. If you can objectify your enemy, if you can put your enemy on the side of the object, then you've already succeeded in establishing this position of strategic advantage. And I'm going to put, just as a kind of dogmatic assertion that people can definitely pick at, of course, that philosophy, modern philosophy in particular, is the self-apprehension of transcendental temporality. So the question of time that's going to be sort of try and get a kind of deep, rigorous grasp of what's meant by acceleration, I think takes us to the core of the modern philosophical enterprise. And by that, I mean it immerses us in these Kantian problems. So the next word on my list is neoliberalism, and I'll try and be even quicker about that, but in the hope, again, that it's something we can come back to. And it plays an important role in the MAP. They're very clear. They sort of date the whole thing where they say that it's a post-1979 configuration of political economy. So they're basically associating it with the sort of Thatcher-Reagan revolution, I'm assuming also Deng Xiaoping in China. All of this incredibly simultaneous sort of catastrophe in a technical sense that happened to the world order at that stage. And I know that their reading of that is very much that this is a kind of realization of certain principles that were formulated by the Pellerin Society, an attempt to put Austrian economics into some kind of practical political effect. And they themselves then say that they text as one of their three what they call medium-term concrete goals. The first of them, they say they want to produce an intellectual infrastructure that is explicitly modeled on the Mont Pelerin Society. There's really only one, at this initial stage, one point that I want to make about this, which is that it's quite clear that the MAP has as a kind of unspoken expectation, and it's perhaps unspoken as as a matter of a political strategy, that to problematize it by making it too explicit would be ineffective in some way or counter-effective. But there is an expectation that neoliberalism would be obsolesced from the left. Now, obviously, as we saw last week, to make sense, the first section of the MAP is called, let me just make sure I get it exactly right. Oh, sorry, I've lost my note, but here, on the conjuncture. Yes, that's right, on the conjuncture. And obviously when they say on the conjuncture, there's all kinds of stuff in there, which again, we can come to do with environmental collapse and all kinds of various types of catastrophes in the colloquial, I think perhaps more than the technical sense. But clearly one absolute crucial structural element of the conjuncture as it is being articulated in this text is exactly this point. Neoliberalism, it can be assumed, is to be obsolesced from the left. Assumed on one level just because it is seen as being the perhaps final configuration of the enemy. If there is any hint at all about a kind of subsequent configuration, it so hazes out into horror that it doesn't take any kind of concrete form. So I think however we make sense of where we are now, which is not an easy thing to think through clearly, but however we think of that, I think at least it places us in a different conjuncture. And I think if there is a certain crisis of the left happening right now, it's precisely because this assumption that the challenge to neoliberalism that mattered was going to come from the left is one that has become problematic. So I think I'll move on from neoliberalism now onto the third one, which is agency. And the relation to agency is totally crucial in the MAP, and it's a huge organizational factor. And I would like to argue it pushes certain questions off the agenda as much as it puts things on the agenda, because of the fact that it's absolutely essential that a certain configuration of agency is sustained in order to make sense of what the text is doing as a political project, as a manifesto, as an intervention within the politics of its conjuncture, and in no doubt a modified way, a continuing intervention that continues into the present time. And okay, sorry, because this is immediately bleeding into the next thing, I should probably let it bleed straight into the next thing. Because the type of construction of agency that is necessary for the MAP to work at what seems to be its political intent requires a certain control of the notion of time. So they say as the first sentence of the final section of the MAP, the future needs to be constructed. Now, this is a very interesting sentence, I think, because what is being said in this sentence clearly is that the future is less ontologically settled than the past. And they consolidate that by saying the choice in the section before, section 23 of the final section, the choice facing us is severe. So, you know, there is a choice. It could go in either direction. What will decide how it tips in one direction or the other is politics. The text itself is an intervention in the political process, attempting to make a decision in terms of this choice presented by history. Why this is, I think, worthy of really concerted attention is the fact that just in terms of the history of accelerationism, it's obviously locking certain things down in a way that is at least questionable. We can take it all the way back to Marx, who's obviously criticized traditionally from the right and then from certain elements in the left for his determinism. You know, the notion that the future is less ontologically settled than the past is a questionable proposition in terms of at least certain constructions of the Marxist philosophy. But I think that it gets more thoroughly unsettled if we take it in two directions. I think, sorry, I'll change that and say the basic direction that makes it is returning to the question of critique, and insisting upon a radically transcendental apprehension of time, which I think is also for accelerationism a transcendental cybernetics, in which time circuitry is primordial or ultimate and is not reducible to some object level transcended sphere of objectivity, according to what might be called a naive realist conception of science and technology. So this, yeah, I'm going to stop. See, there's two things I want to say to kind of dig into this a little further at this stage. So the first is that I think the MAP itself has a much more intricate relation to time than it is actually happy with having. And there are some sentences I think are deeply emblematic of that. But if I go back to their to the level that seems closest to their manifest intention, sorry, 1 second. They say, sorry, I'm trying to find the thing where they say about, I think it would be better if I just look at the text for a second. One minute. So I want on accelerationisms. Yes. So on accelerationisms is dealing with this question. In chapter 2, is the thing that I have my most, as might be expected, my most severe kind of problems with this text, and I think that it's the most botched level of their philosophical discussion. And what they're doing here is they're trying to separate a capitalistic notion of speed. They're not very explicit about wanting to kind of critically delimit it, but it could be taken in that sense, from what how they want to use the word acceleration as something that is well, I will say transcendental, but what their actual words is an acceleration which is also navigational and experimental process of discovery within a universal space of possibility. And then they go on in the next paragraph to say, even worse, as Deleuze and Guattari recognized from the very beginning with capitalist speed, what capitalist speed deterritorializes with one hand, it re-territorializes with the other. So there is a progressive and a regressive that is inseparable within capitalism, and they're treating this as a critique. This is why capitalism is a form of constraint for them, because of the fact it can't escape this double pincer, if I'm gonna use Deleuze and Guattari language with this, of these two different impulses. And then they end this section by saying Thatcherite Reaganite deregulation sits comfortably alongside Victorian back to basics family and religious values. So that's the concrete instantiation of this. And I think, tracking it forward a little bit, you can say, you take this dynamic, this from a certain perspective, double pincer, you get something that is like near reaction. You get something that is simultaneously a futuristic and regressive program. But then, and this is why I think they are saying more than they want to say, there is a truly fantastic sentence. I think it's my favorite in the MAP, where they say in section 3, part 22, we need to revive the argument that was traditionally made for post-capitalism. Now, this is an absolutely fantastic phrase, I'm sure. I mean, it's so time-tangled. It's absolutely unbelievable. It's a revival. It's a return to tradition. It's an invocation of post-capitalism. It's absolutely complex in this sense of being deeply ambiguous or schizoid in terms of its temporal structure. And I think this goes deep into their project, that the project of left accelerationism, as outlined in the MAP, is retro-progressivist. And actually, it has exactly the same retro-progressivist time structure as right accelerationism, in the sense that it is both a kind of hyper-futuristic and drawn back particularly to something like the 1920s. You know, it's like Art Deco. It's a return to this point at which modernization was lost. You know, obviously from the right, that's from it's lost because of the New Deal and the kind of the destruction of classical liberalism. From the left, it's lost by the disappointments of Soviet communism and the betrayal from that point of view of these socialist dreams of contemporary with the Bolshevik Revolution. So it doesn't seem to me, even though the MAP wants to say it has an unambiguous futurist orientation, it has an unambiguous sense of what modernization would mean in terms of being forward-looking rather than backward-looking. I don't think the text itself supports that. I think that there is no difference in terms of the degree to which this retrospective element of retrieval is operating in the MAP and as it is operating on the right side of the accelerationist project. And so I'm going to just round off this. So I'll say one more thing about that and then get to my final point. So for everyone who wasn't there, or even people who were there as a reminder, when we were looking at on the geology of morals in the economics course, there's this complex process that is happening in the direction of absolute deterritorialization in the text. It's exactly trying to indicate something on the far side of the relative deterritorialization that is captured by their phrase, perfectly unobjectionable gloss of Deleuze and Guattari, to quote them again: what capitalists be deterritorialized with one hand, it re-territorializes with the other. And as we saw in that text, Challenger, the protagonist, the pseudo-human interlocutor of that text, in the process of this engagement with this double-pincered system in the direction of deterritorialization, acquires claws. You know, he himself becomes this claw-handed, double-pincered being, precisely because the vector of absolute deterritorialization requires that there is a simultaneous of these two, of both sides of the double pincer. That the double pincer, as we discussed in that course, the double pincer works by the fact that you're only on one side or the other of the double pincer at any particular time. And it's being able to simultaneously get those two different tensed complementary double pincer structures and package that is a mark of within the strata of a line of absolute destratification, or a tendency to absolute deterritorialization. And in temporal terms, it has to be noted that the transcendental philosophy of time cannot privilege the future as anything less ontologically settled than the past. To do that is precisely to fall into a metaphysics of time. Absolute transcendental temporality cannot be any more real in the past than the future. The differentiation of past, present, and future, the articulation of time, is transcendentally simultaneous. It's not something that can privilege one particular temporal orientation over another. So we would expect that transcendental temporalization would exactly manifest itself within the strata, within the complementary system of deterritorialization, as something like a retro-progressivism or a neo-reaction or a cyber-Gothic or any of these other terms that capture the profound ambiguity of time. And I want to say MAP is doing that just as much as Thatcherite, Reagan, proto-neo-reaction, or whatever you want to call it, or any other system of reterritorialization. Deterritorialization, the structure of retro-progressivism is absolutely basic and structural to the MAP. So the final thing in these talking points I want to say is taking obviously anti-Oedipus as a kind of stimulus to that is to say a little thing about Oedipus, which it's obviously at the most inane level of reading that text, it's basically saying let's forget about Oedipus. Oedipus is not interesting. I want to say Oedipus is extremely interesting. Oedipus is all about this templex structure. Obviously, we know from the myth that Oedipus's action is guided by the fact that there is a prophecy about what will happen to him, and that he will kill his mother, kill his father, marry his mother. That prophecy then becomes an incentive to action that is self-fulfilling. So the figure of the Sphinx is a figure of transcendental temporality within the Oedipus myth, and Oedipus, the tragedy of Oedipus is tied up with this structure of templexity absolutely integrally. It makes you cannot read the play at all, or the plays, the myth, the structure there at all, without this temporal complexity being essential to it. And this is obviously, I won't simply say devastating, because I think that makes it sound too one-sided and simple, but it's massively complicating of any notion of agency. It certainly makes the notion, to go back to this quote, the future needs to be constructed, which is a fantastically convenient platform for political action, hugely complicated. You know, Oedipus cannot be assembled as a political agent in the kind of way that the MAP wants to constitute a political agency, because of the fact that the future is already operative on the past. The future is no less ontologically past, and so the situation of Oedipus, which is the situation of any subject caught in time anomaly, is a situation of transcendental time circuitry. It's a situation in which no way to derealize the future in order to make it a completely plastic object for political praxis in a way that's kind of fundamentally distinct from the past. Of course, you know, if once you go into that terrain, then what you mean by politics, what you mean by political possibility, their term again being a universal space of possibility. These are concepts that become usable at a first order level. They have to be fed through this transcendental philosophy of time and undergo some kind of drastic revision of a kind that I don't think the MAP wants to do for intelligible purposes. So I'm going to treat that as a stopping point and see what responses people have to this. In general, of course, not just my suggestive lines of inquiry into the text.
Can I just hop in and say some like first reaction to the sort of like
yes.
this notion of time as both sort of a unified structure where the past is as unchangeable as the future, seemingly,
or inversely. Oh yeah, sorry. No, you're saying about the version that they are wanting to hold on.
Oh no. Oh, maybe I'm misunderstanding. It's inversely.
I'm saying that there was that the notion that the future is less ontologically settled than the past is transcendentally unsustainable position. It's a metaphysics of time in a strict critical sense, and it's convenient for political orientation, but it's not a philosophically sustainable commitment. So the question is, once you allow, obviously a prophecy is an action of the future upon the past. Once you allow this basic, I'm not going to say symmetry, I think that maybe simplifies it too much, but this circuitry that is irreducible, that it's not that there is a kind of one-way temporal flow within which empirically circuits can be inscribed for technical purposes, but the diagram of the circuit is fundamental and irreducible and coincident with temporality.
So yeah, I'm just trying to grasp this fully. I think that on the one hand, there's this seeming development happening, or at least change happening. But on the other hand, there's this really rigid Parmenidean notion of time in a way, right?
Well, it may, I think, to say rigid Parmenidean, that is one line of approach you could take to it, but that is itself perhaps one-sided. I mean, you could say about the Parmenidean approach that what he does is he takes the empirical model of the past and tries to impose that on temporality as a whole. So, you know, it too is a kind of a lopsided philosophical approach, I think, to transcendental temporality. You could just as much do the other way round and destabilize the past from the side of the future.
Right, right.
What you can't do, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I'd happily let you continue.
No. I'm just saying that what you can't do is reduce the circuit to a mere empirical object within time.
Right.
It's the circuit is a transcendental structure, and I think accelerationism. I would want to propose that acceleration is transcendental cybernetics. Before we even mention capitalism or any of these points of division that inevitably are going to come up, that seems to me the most fundamental definition of what accelerationism is. And I think the MAP is sucked into that despite itself. I mean, even though on one level of political convenience, it's the last thing that they want to do, on the other hand, there are all these strange little rhetorical clues and structural elements in the text and around the text that are recomposing this transcendental time circuit that then complicates the notion of agency far more than they want that notion to be complicated.
Nick, could you perhaps comment a little more on, this isn't really a subject I'm familiar with, but your conception of time circuitry working from the future backwards, other than kind of getting into like the, Oedipus analogy of, almost prophecy. What would be the mechanisms of, how time could kind of go backwards in a cause and effect type of manner?
Well, there's lots of different ways to take this. I mean, one book that I'm sure I have, I think that this topic came up in the last course, and I recommended a book by Hugh Price. Now, it's not for me a philosophical resting point. I'd want to raise questions about this. Here, look, this is a link to this book. But I think it's an absolutely crucial correction to prevalent assumptions. Sorry, one second. I'm just going to put this in the sidebar again. This is Hugh Price's book. It's called Time's Arrow and Archimedes' Point. And his project is to theoretically eliminate time asymmetry. He says, classical physics is completely asymmetric. You can run any mechanical equation forwards or backwards. To say that time is running in one direction rather than the other direction is completely arbitrary. You can take any big Newtonian structure of celestial mechanics or anything you like, flip it completely over in terms of its time direction, and you can't tell. There's nothing that allows you to say which is the right way round and which is the wrong way round. There's perfect asymmetry. And what Hugh Price does in this book is he goes through all the difficult cases for this, which is in particular everything associated with thermodynamics, which seems to install this asymmetric structure of time in terms of unidirectional entropy increase, and even more at the heart of his own interest is quantum mechanics and this notion of a kind of collapse of the wave function only in one direction of time, which is associated with sorry, one second. that the thing that I just want to mention with this is that the arguments in the early stage of the formulation of quantum mechanics, interestingly, were very tied up with agency. Like, you know, in a way that I find very surprising, to be honest. You know, there were scientists saying, well, look, we can't do the kind of things which would allow us to have perfect symmetry between forward and backward causality in quantum mechanics, because that would eliminate free will. They actually use that word. And Hugh Price's position, basically, he says that he's not doing this and that he's defending some compatibilist notion of free will. But he basically says, look, the notion that some poorly formulated notion like free will could get in the notion of a neat, consistent physics is completely crazy. And so he just washes right through and says that, you know, you can produce an extremely neat, completely symmetrical microphysics that captures the entire content of quantum mechanics, and he says also can deal with all of the thermodynamic difficulties. So this is so against kind of standard intuitions, and I would take it so against what the MAP wants to maintain, certain sense, beyond question. You know, that time asymmetry for them is something so essential to the possibility of political action that it's pushed off the boundaries of their discussion. And so, you know, on one level, I think their text becomes philosophically thin in this area. I mean, the notion of time, if you say, well, what is the conception of time in the MAP? It is quite thin. It's not transcendentally dense. It's not open to these kind of questions about whether time asymmetry is something we can rely upon unproblematically. So yeah, sorry, this is very brief. The point is, this is huge and disconcerting topic. So I hope that we will stick with it rather than me try to wrap it up in some rapid way.
I wonder whether this question about time can be mapped onto the MAP as a political project, because one thing that strikes me is that it almost seems to me like, despite themselves, what Cernacek and Williams are constructing is actually a kind of moment within the time circuit rather than an actual conception of acceleration as such. They're very concerned with particular moments of development, like the Mont Pelerin Society, or like basically what I see as developmentalism, as trying to marry the plan and the network. And so I wonder whether one way of looking at it might just be that they are looking at constructing an articulate kind of conception of one specific moment.
But no, when you say one specific moment, do you think that is the same as on the conjuncture, as the, you know, that's the moment? Do you think the sort of introduction to the text is describing and framing that moment, or are you wanting to locate it differently?
I don't think so. I think my focus is more on the kind of the third section of the text, when they're kind of presenting a political program. The moment that they're mapping is a kind of abstract moment in the process of capitalist development, not what they see as the current conjuncture, but a particular kind of process that has happened in the past through things like developmentalism, through things like even, you know, the Soviet experience and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm inclined to ask you to say a bit more on this moment. I mean, give me some sort of coordinates to locate it.
Well, their concern politically seems to be to kind of accelerate development in a way that capitalism seems not to be able to manage on its own, at least from their perspective. And this seems to me basically to be the kind of process that you see in, firstly, when Marx talks about primitive accumulation, but in general, this idea that you have some kind of process whereby capital accumulation is forcibly restarted. And Sernacek and Williams talk about how, quote, the command of the plan must be married to the improvised order of the network. And that seems to be roughly how these phases of accumulation have happened historically. But this isn't the specific current conjuncture. This is just an abstract moment in the development process.
Yeah, I think this ties in with something that I thought was also an interesting line of discussion on this. I'd see whether you think it connects, which is that there's obviously, if we go back to this almost one way you can do it is just go back to the Zelinsky quote and say, you know, that the strategic level of this is about actually objectifying your enemy. So obviously the goal, what defines it as a left project from them, is that the enemy to be objectified is capital. And capital is the thing they do not want is for capital to be located in this transcendental to the question they're asking. But you could sort of conceive that coming maybe from there, something that would at least position itself to their left or describe itself as coming from their left. It's not something that would never be necessarily a right-wing objection at all. Someone could say, well, look, wouldn't actually the kind of self-propelling, modernizing mechanism that you're wanting to constitute actually be a reconstitution of capital in the actual interstices of this? You know, that if you understand capital with sufficient abstraction as this self-regenerating, abstract, quantitative element that actually gives a vector to growth within the system considered, then what you're trying to do is actually just is to use your terms, is to reboot capital, reinstall capital, or reinitiate, reignite a certain type of capital in something that was calling itself a left planning socialist even project. And it's obviously sort of that ties up with a kind of Trotskyite criticism of the Soviet Union and you know, this accusation of state capitalism, or on the other side, this Mao's sort of motivation for the Cultural Revolution of this kind of, you know, insidious tendency of capital to reconstitute itself within any kind of as what they call socio-technical machine or socio-technical circuit.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I find interesting is that there are these readings which basically say, for example, that the Soviet Union, certainly in its Stalinist phase, basically was a way for industrial capitalism to emerge in Russia despite itself, or even Maoist China laid the Dengist reforms. So I wonder whether these just kind of add up to a particular moment. Yeah, that's my general kind of thought on this.
Yes, and but just to one last thing to try and just get this nailed down as much as possible. When you say a moment, you're particularly referencing a kind of moment of primitive accumulation, of a kind of a moment of capitalist reignition. Is that right? Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Kind of coercive accumulation. Yeah.
So I'll just hop in and say one more thing. I'm probably just misunderstanding you, but on the one hand, it seems like you're saying there's like this time agnosticism, where we can't necessarily point towards any direction that time has or any direction that causation has. And on the other hand, there's this argument that says, well, capitalism tends towards this direction.
Yes.
You know, and that direction is sort of a snowball, a cumulative, faster and towards entropy almost. So how do those two versions stand together? Or correct me if I'm misinterpreting.
No, it's not. It's not the sort of zone that could be about misinterpretation, because it's a problem. You know, it's on one hand it is the problem of transcendental philosophy, and then concretely it's a problem of exactly the kind that you're talking about here. And for instance, Hugh Price, who my suspicion is that his account is kind of, you know, one-sided. So, you know, I'm not saying it's exactly Parmenidean, but it's an analogous. The kind of reservations I would have about a Parmenidean solution to this is the same kind of reservations I've got about Hugh Price's project. But because it's contrarian in its one-sidedness, I highly recommend it, and it is really interesting. And what he would say about this is, you know, there's an extremely straightforward way of reconciling those two things, is that is time symmetric. So we can agree that capital by definition is cumulative, perhaps however you're wanting to define that. A negative entropy accumulation is one typical way of doing that. You know, that's the same as calling it an evolutionary process when people fuse Darwinism and thermodynamics. But in saying that, and in saying that you can tell it defines a direction of time, in the sense that unlike our Newtonian mechanics, if you had a video of a process of biological evolution or a process of capitalist development, and played it in two different ways, people could work out the arrow of time, and tell you, look, you're playing that backwards. You know, it would be clear to people that was happening. But that, Hugh Price says, doesn't tell you actually anything about the line of causality at all. You know, you can see, even once you've started playing this video the right way round, you can just as much say that the outcome of this process as causally imposes upon the past the precursors required to bring about that process, as you can say the other way around, you know, mechanically, that the precursors of the process cause the process later to emerge. So it's obviously the classical distinction between efficient and final causality, or mechanical and final causality. And obviously modernity has sided massively against final causality, generally speaking. But I would say the same thing about that as I would say about the MAP, that it doesn't really manage to conjure away this demon, and all these structures of teleology or final causality constantly re-emerge in modernity. And in fact, ironically, an irony basically is transcendental philosophy as a rhetorical device. Ironically, the extermination of teleological thinking becomes itself this guiding teleological process in modern science. So you can almost, you know, from a certain perspective, you can say how radically modernized the scientific enterprise has come by the degree to which it has extirpated teleological thinking, and therefore actually installed this highly efficient teleological dynamic.
So, I mean, my first thought is that seems so pre-Kantian. Like it seems like Kant's idea of time and of agency would want to prevent the sort of scholastic version of the final cause.
Yes.
And that's, I think, why deontology and duty is so important for Kant.
But the transcendental subject is not, subject is in time. So we know it cannot be the case that the pure subject of practical reason cannot actually be within a time series. Only the empirical ego is in a time series. But on the other side, I think it's really crucial for sure what you're saying here. And I think the point that has to be made is the critique of teleology is absolutely crucial. You know, like teleology, like anything else, is prone to metaphysics. And as soon as the telos is constituted as an object, then you have a metaphysical teleology. And so just the radical prosecution of the critical enterprise, in that sense, is anti-teleological. It's certainly anti-scholastic, even if I'm sure there's defenders of scholasticism would say that, if I can bracket that. So, you know, I want to have both in a sense. It's like that the critique of teleology does not mean that you are just left neatly and conveniently with mechanical causation. It's rather that you're left with a comprehensive critique of both mechanical and teleological causality, in which time is not, and it's not reduced to an object in terms of in a finalistic form as a telos, or as a mechanical form as a original primal cause. Both of those would be pre-critical errors and metaphysics of time.
Nick, I think one of the I think the second section in the manifesto is named interregnum. This idea of suspension is
right.
Seems to be. I'm not quite sure how to. It's like the problem of suspension.
Right.
Within the modernist project, or the kind of the way that the present becomes suspended as a problem for the left is constructed by the left through its commitments to the kind of extension of a modernist sense of time. I don't know whether that's making any sense yet.
No, it is. It's very interesting because I haven't sort of taken that word seriously prior to you pointing out, and obviously it is absolutely fascinating that the actual on accelerationisms is put in this interregnum position. Definitely. So that whole discussion is, as you say, in some strange sense, bracketed, isn't it?
But it seems to be it's like a short circuit within.
I mean, it's implicit. What seems to be the implicit suggestion is that it's somehow undecided, isn't it? That this interregnum is the fact that there's a decision about the meaning of acceleration that we're awaiting, and that once that decision is made in the direction recommended by the MAP, then things move forward into this. So their final section on the future. So you restore the movement into the future once you resolve this dilemma on the correct meaning of acceleration. But yes, no, it is really interesting.
I wonder if this idea of suspension is also some kind of positive program, in the sense that it might tie in with this whole kind of Benjaminian idea that time is kind of piling catastrophe on catastrophe and you need to call a halt to it as some kind of radical emancipatory moment.
Right. That certainly ties up with this extremely excited rhetoric of the first, even maybe you see it best in the first two sections, isn't it? You know, global civilization faces a new breed of cataclysm, these coming apocalypses. They've got a whole thing where it's about these annihilations. So that it starts definitely with this sense of absolute, yes, the sort of apocalyptic content of the trajectory that we're on, which I guess sets then the political problem that the MAP is setting itself. I mean, it is very interesting, the role of this text as a kind of exhortation, isn't it? Because it's, you know, after setting out this kind of dismal apocalyptic, it then moves into this whole discussion of how deeply the left has failed. You know, it's a kind of, the left is being castigated for its failure to adequately address itself to this scale of this problem, and obviously what will then go into their critique of folk politics and all of this kind of thing. So there's this definite sense of this, the necessity of this exhortation, in the sense that there's been a complete default or deficiency. So in this way, it's a real sort of, there's a kind of symmetry to a certain kind of construction of a right accelerationism, where rather than saying there's this motor that is just automatically generating this revolutionary potential, or the same then in a certain kind of Marx, where, you know, you've got this rolling inevitability of a kind of socialist insurrection coming from the mechanics of history and the dynamics of capitalism. There's something very different in this, which is seeming to say that things have to be just booted up from the start, and from the left side, you know, all the resources to be gained and to be exploited and to be repurposed are coming up from the capitalist side, and from the left side there's only this kind of sad morass, a kind of loss of a sense of a future, a kind of relapse into folk politics, you know, this kind of failure that is being diagnosed on the left side. So all the optimism of the text from its own political point of view comes from the possibility of reversing and changing direction of this basically collapse of an adequate left response to the catastrophic momentum of capitalism.
Does that sense of the kind of lost future? I mean, is that an expression that is that something that only the left feels? You know, is there a sense that the future is lost in right accelerationist thought?
I think that this is an interesting question, and I think that it's very complicated. I think that, going back to this question about neoliberalism, what, again, as a sort of, it's a structural political necessity for that tech, that neoliberalism will be obsolete from the left. So from the point of view, and I think in this sense it speaks very widely for a certain sort of left intellectual constituency, it's taken as kind of given that the right must be happy about what is happening. You know, it's like they're saying anything that is so upsetting to us surely has to be absolutely euphorically exciting and whatever to our enemies, you know, because we couldn't feel that we're being beaten up so badly without them thinking that they're winning this fight. But I don't think that that's very clear. I mean, I think a lot of the things that have happened on the right, on, again, quite a wide swathe, have been based, as you're sort of suggesting, on a symmetrical despair about neoliberalism. And I think that, you know, obviously, from the position, you know, it's all a bit complicated and tangled, because by saying that what neoliberalism is the attempt to put Austrian economics into action, you sort of left almost with the necessary conclusion that, of course, the right have to treat this as a triumph. I think that probably is true for a very short time in the early 1980s. You know, I think that would totally capture the balance of affect. But I think that faded out fast, and neoliberalism on the right became a sign. It's not that they would use the word very much, but the same constellation of political and economic forces was a source of absolute despair on the right too. You know, and a lot of the things that have happened, I think, are a response to that despair. The fact that conservatism has basically just combusted is because it is seen on the right as having totally failed. And you know, in the recent transition, if you were to say, well, who was the neoliberal candidate in the American election, say, or who was the neoliberal camp in the Brexit referendum, people would say it was the Remainers who were the neoliberals in the Brexit referendum, and it was Hillary Clinton who was the neoliberal candidate in the American election. I mean, isn't that right? I do think there has been this, I won't say it's as simple as just flipping over, but I think there's been an exposure of how the optic of the MAP is in this respect. And I think it's a one-sidedness that is very, very prevalent on the left. And part of what I think has been the trauma of recent events is this notion that it was unthinkable that you could have anything worse. You know, it's like neoliberalism. You could have neoliberalism, or you could have it collapsing into climate change and more disorder and more inequality and all of these degeneracies as far as they're concerned, all of which are already folded within neoliberalism. So all that you're saying is neoliberalism is getting worse. So the notion that there could be an insurrection against neoliberalism from the right was off the radar entirely, and I think, you know, deeply traumatizing. And I don't want to say that's simple. I mean, like we were saying last week, I don't think it's clear, you know, how none of these things are simple in terms of, you know, what is the Brexit constituency to the right of the Remainers, or you know, to what extent, what is the right wing orientation of Donald Trump? None of these things are straightforward, but I do think that there is this sense that the notion that neoliberalism sort of filled out the whole space of right political economic possibility is something that has just collapsed and left us in, what is it, not the conjuncture that is being described at the beginning of the MAP.
I think one of the things that makes it so, I guess, difficult is the ways that, you know, Barbrook and co, in that expression that you've used, the Californian ideology, that the same, in a sense, the same model of time, the kind of ninefold manifold or, of time complexity, is at work in both left and right accelerationism and in neoliberalism. I mean, is that right, that we're sharing that same model of time?
Well, I think that's an interesting suggestion, and it's obviously at least partly what I wanted to suggest in the way I laid things out here. In that, I think that what you're seeing, you know, this structure of time, is the impression of a transcendental incursion, you know, as it is seen. And the basic symptom of that transcendental incursion is exactly like Professor Challenger's crab hands. It's all of these split time concepts. I mean, as I say, you know, retro progressivism, neo-reaction, cyber gothic. I'm sure that it could be added, you know, neo-traditionalism, you know, the whole set of terms. A famous one is this French philosopher Guillaume Fay's archaeofuturism. You know, I think you could compile a big list of these terms, all of which are, to me, symptomatic of a transcendental incursion. The fact that you have this seemingly paradoxical time structure being evoked is a sign that something is coming diagonally into the temporal order that can't be sorted or ordered neatly in terms of sort of the most convenient notions of past, present, and future that the metaphysics of time would tolerate.
In that vein, I thought it's interesting that you mentioned Brexit there, because it seems like Brexit very much has the structure of one of these temporal circuits in a way that's sort of specifically modified by being empirically fixed to a particular point at its beginning, and then having this sort of spread of possibilities, repeating it at its putative end. So that, like, once you voted for, you know, you voted to leave, right? It still may not be the case that you ever actually leave because of various political forces that happen in the interim. What happens in the interim affects what the consequences of actually leaving are, the chances of actually leaving, and that continues to roll back and affect the decisions that people are making politically and economically, so forth. At every point, like, you know, in the most gross way, like whether the market rises or falls after a vote for leave is something that's washing back from that uncertain repetition 5 years away. And so inside of that interval, it seems like, you know, we're seeing, I guess that's my question, is whether are we literally seeing something that recapitulates the larger temporal sort of circuit structure of capitalism's acceleration? Are we seeing that, you know, by that sort of partially empiricized recapitulation, that is an opportunity for intervention against neoliberalism at, like, in some sort of specific and privileged way? And then in that sense of having a lost future for leftism, is that lost future analogous to, or in what way different from, the sort of empty superpositional future of what Brexit, real Brexit, future Brexit actually was?
Yeah. It's extremely interesting. I mean, part one aspect of it is this whole massive role that prediction plays in all of these things, isn't it? Like so much of this current, you know, if we're in a new conjuncture in some sense, one of the defining features of that is all of the voices of expertise saying, we called it totally wrong. You know, we had an absolutely confident prediction that X was going to happen, and here we are in Y. And you hear that over and over again. You know, I called Brexit wrong. I called the American election wrong. I called it wrong. It's inescapable for everyone to do it. The prediction markets called it wrong. Maybe the financial markets called it wrong. On one level, then you say, well, you know, doesn't that show that in what you're dealing with here is simply prediction? You know, that you don't have a time scrambling structure of prophecy at work in this at all. You know, you have a notion of prediction that is just empirical, forward oriented, and the fact that it can be completely collapsed like this by an unexpected event is a sign that any suggestion that you have this actual time circuitry at work has been proved to be illusory. And so there's a certain very, very rigorous collapse of the future that happens with that. And I think what the contour that's being shown here is exactly the contour between the strata and the zone of deterritorialization, of destratification. It's the limits of relative deterritorialization. It's the distinction between capital as object and capital as transcendental structure. There's a line that's being drawn, which is the line of whether you actually have efficient processes operating upon the past from the future. Is the future operating as an efficient object? And I think that it's necessarily ambiguous. It's never that you're going to be able to say, except with a certain kind of dogmatic hyperbole, that it's one way or another. I mean, there's very strong reasons of just rigorous transcendental philosophy to push it in one direction. There's very strong reasons from sort of the continuous reconstitution of empirical common sense to run it the other way. And the question is the trend of capital and the trend of technology, Moore's law would be a good example, or any of these things, the tendency to internet decentralization, the reconstitution continuously of the Californian ideology at higher levels of intensity, are those things merely empirical or historical products? Or are they actually showing us the contours of this large-scale retrochronic impact?
Okay, I was just going to say, but what would it even mean to say tendency in that sense? I guess, like, tendency makes it seem as if it's moving with an incentive towards a certain direction, no? Or are you saying that's one perspective to think about it in terms of like an incentive motive.
Whichever direction you run it in, I think you can use that language for sure. Like if there is an efficient futural hyper object shaping the structure of history, then it will obviously manifest itself through powerful tendencies. You know, it's like the way that often is good to do this, and I think everyone does it. Hugh Price also uses this language very much. Is this thing about convergent and divergent waves. If you actually have a convergent wave, so that you throw a pebble into the pond, the ripples go out, then you reverse the film, all the ripples are heading in towards this singularity in the middle of the pond, and then you say, yeah, the reverse footage is the one that actually shows us the structure of history. So we're seeing a convergent wave, and that's why we're back to this question of prediction. This is why we can predict or even prophesy certain historical patterns, is because it's the convergent wave that is actually the primary one in this case. And I think capitalism is at least massively persuasive as a simulation of teleology. So even if you end up wanting to say, look, it's all a kind of illusion, and all you really have is divergent waves, there aren't really efficient convergent waves in history, it's still the case that understanding the let's say pseudo-teleological structure of capitalism allows you to make extremely strong predictions about its general trend, just as if it was a convergent wave. I mean, the internet, Bitcoin, these thresholds are absolutely predictable on an abstract level. I mean, of course, no one predicted Bitcoin in terms of its detail, but everyone who was paying any realistic attention to capitalism predicted Bitcoin in terms of its basic architecture and its basic social function, and the fact that it would be decentralized, anonymous, it would lack controlling nodes. Everyone knows that is the capitalistic telos, that capitalism likes things like the internet, it likes things that are decentralized, commercial, flat systems without dominant nodes, and it will end up doing something down the road more like that than anything we've seen so far. And people who've made that bet always win. Now people would say to me, oh, that's an illusion. I mean, and I have to say, yes, from a certain empirical position, of course you can say that, but it seems to me that capitalism stimulates prophecy by its own extremely plausible, at least pseudo-teleological structure.
So I think this sort of relates to this comment I put in the sidebar that says, well, the whole notion of the Darwinian economic model, which is based on incentives and drives to survive, is made more problematic by the poor parameterless definitions that it uses. It wraps up so many things at once, increasing complexification of organisms with the gradual inevitable breakdown and decomposition through entropy. It wraps up being and non-being, survival and death, production, anti-production, deterritorialization, reterritorialization, Dionysus, Apollo. It seems like all of these terms are not necessarily synonymous. Like, obviously death is not the same thing as non-being, right? Unless we're talking about some sort of spirit entity. But right. And then the other obvious dichotomy is being and becoming. And being obviously isn't the same thing as just survival. I'm not sure exactly how this maps on to this conversation of time, but it definitely, I think it maps on really well to the conversation about causality.
Just say a little bit more about that mapping. So,
sure, yeah, I can try. Well, I think that the way that I understand Deleuze and Guattari and Nietzsche as well to sort of characterize how things take place in the cosmos is by making these two poles. And for Deleuze and Guattari, it's the reterritorializing or the deterritorializing hand of capitalism followed by the reterritorialization. It's like there's no pure deterritorialization. Every deterritorialization is actually another reterritorialization. And yet it tends towards pure deterritorialization. So my question is, in that model where you have these two poles, it doesn't seem that those two poles are the same thing that the Darwinian model is using to talk about when it's talking about the growing complexity of living organisms. And it doesn't strike me as the same thing as when we talk about entropy, when we talk about the two poles of organization towards disorganization. I'm not sure that they're the same, or I'm not sure how they could be the same.
My sort of translation matrix would obviously be run through cybernetics on this, which is that the two poles you're talking about are the two poles of your cybernetic circuit. So if they have a negative link, so you have a stable system, then you have complementary deterritorialization and reterritorialization. So the system drifts on one pole and is restabilized on the other pole. And the system is reversible. So you can, if they're complementary, you can, within any such complementary stratic double pincer system, you can actually say either is the deterritorializing or reterritorializing pole. The important thing is they're complementary. So there's drift and counter drift. It doesn't matter which you call which. A line of absolute deterritorialization would be a pure positive feedback circuit, which is uncompensated drift. And obviously, as critics of this sort of notion say, or at least suggest, because I'm not wanting to say that they're simply right, what they want to suggest is that there is actually always a compensatory, an invisible compensatory pole when it seems that you have this pole of absolute drift. So, you have a musical feedback or whatever, and it will go up to to climax in screeching howl, and something will bring it back down on the other side. It will explode, it will crash, it doesn't go to infinite volume. Or like we were talking last week, John Michael Greer's whole philosophy of history is like this. You see these apparently lines of continuous absolute deterritorialization. In his terms, they're things like energy consumption, economic growth, progress, modernization. And to use the MAP language, his wager is that there's always a complementary, you could say reterritorializing, complementary pole that produces, when you see the whole diagram of the system, that produces a homeostatic stratic system. This is obviously not his language. So that's the matrix that I would use to try and cross-link these various systems. So for organisms, there are certain lines that look like a form of uncompensated drift, and if you pan out into the deep history and ecological structure of those systems, do you find some compensatory system? So, I mean, there are obvious examples all through evolutionary biology. The neatest examples, and probably I would hazard the guess most prevalent, are arms races. So, some animal evolves some mutation in a direction that seems to guarantee this open horizon of controlled propagation, and some compensating element in terms of predator species or food supply limits, but I'll leave that out because that's complicating it. Some competitive species will adapt in a way that restores the system to equilibrium. So the system as a whole is at a higher level homeostatic, even when it seems to be populated by these vectors of uncompensated drift or mutation. And capitalism is the first thing that we've ever seen that at least throws into very serious question the compensatory side of the equation. I mean, well, I should stop there. It gets into something huge as well.
Or could you go into that more?
Well, I think that one of the basic left-right accelerationism questions is this thing about, have left and right acceleration just existing, mobilization, rhetoric, and all of this stuff, and just diagrams.
We just lost you for about 40 seconds. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, it just saying, if you had left and right accelerationism at a blackboard and someone said, just draw your diagrams, you know what I mean? Quit the political squabbling for a minute and just show me the diagram that you're drawing. And I think the right accelerationist diagram, as the left accelerationists, I think, are perceptive enough to see, basically has the left as the compensatory reterritorializing element. So when the MAP says, capitalists be deterritorialized with one hand, reterritorialized with the other for right accelerationism is the left, and the MAP is the reterritorialization, which I guess it's an irony, but I think it's one they're aware of. Sorry, they have a line that shows that they totally understand that is the criticism that is being made. Sorry, I won't waste our time by trying to find it right now. Whereas obviously for the left accelerationists, it's rather that they're wanting to locate what they call the true agent acceleration outside capital, and capital itself at a certain stage at least that they think we have now reached, they explicitly say, is itself acting as the compensator and working to I mean, there's probably 20 quotes that we could use for this, but they say capitalism is a system that holds back progress. Our technological development is being suppressed by capitalism, and as much as it has been unleashed. So so I think you'd be drawing the same circuit diagrams, and you'd just be putting different terms on that. But and I'm not saying it's a trivial thing, or that this nomenclature issue just goes down to some trivial issue like that. But I think that there is a level of there has to be a level of fundamental agreement at the level of transcendental cybernetics that what you're drawing, if you left off all the labels, what you're drawing as a diagram of an accelerating process, a process of absolute deterritorialization, an uncompensated process of drift, is the same. So I think that's why at the end, it's still, despite everything and despite all the massive disagreement about what these terms mean, that there is such a thing as accelerationism that crosses all of these partisan battle lines.
Seems like that means there also has to be a difference in conceiving of the role of desire and anxiety in driving the deterritorialization. Like that what's something that I feel like I don't totally understand about the left accelerationist view is that without all the competition and anxiety and desire, what continues to drive the process forward? Like that, like that seems like the key variable is sort of the sense of impending doom and the need to gain.
Right.
That's what sort of generates the new things.
Yes. I mean, look, I'm the last person who should sort of pretend to be able to adequately represent their response. I would assume that they would say that there is a kind of a distortion and perversion of this libidinal structure of production and technological production within capitalism, and that it can be driven by a configuration of desire that is fundamentally cooperative in nature, that is not sort of tuned by anxiety and such like. But I'm sure that there's people who could do a better job of that than I could.
Yeah, hence the perhaps the emphasis on law-like structures too. Coming from
On their side.
Yes.
Or,
on the left.
Right.
What about the law-like structures?
I guess I would see the law-like structures as like a within the dialectic that we're talking about as like sort of a way of directing, channeling forces in a potentially more egalitarian structure, towards a more egalitarian structure. So the aim of the law is to somehow create that. I think this is what Vincent meant, but create that moment. I'm not sure if I don't want to speak for you, but
yeah, I don't think Vincent's rising to the bait at that point. Yeah.
Just sort of following up on something I said in the sidebar, it just seems to me like just utterly obvious, regardless of where in this sort of supposed partisan spectrum of accelerationism you are, that and pivoting and so forth, the other aspects of what is like technically acceleration, so any direct had as like tools in the toolbox of tactical concerns of any kind of acceleration, because if the context of what we call accelerationism is like accelerate all around as something initiated, by the Industrial Revolution or whatever, there are like wildly different for any possible politics aspects of that acceleration that have wildly different variances. So like the acceleration of, you know, disruptive environmental catastrophes or like flows of mass migration in the world, and the acceleration of like our ability to cognitively predict what's going to happen 10 years or 10 minutes from now, all of those things. Like if you just uniformly can't differentiate between the ways of responding to those different things, so that one thing you might, you know, your task is to decelerate this process locally as opposed to globally, and then in another case it's to accelerate this process to contradiction, then you have no way to navigate or to actually like see the environment of acceleration gradients. This sort of confusion of everything is accelerating around us, therefore our politics is sort of like directly a mirrored, you know, reflection of this particular kind of acceleration. That just seems like an elementary mistake, like of almost the exact same kind as like pre-Brexit, all of these prediction markets and Nate Silver and who the hell ever, right, who are only able, I mean, I'd argue, to have predicted that Brexit would, or that the Brexit vote would remain, because their entire basis for prediction was a theory of incentive, namely a neoliberal one, under which it would never make sense for the constituents of any market to do a thing like voting for Brexit. And so that leads the, you know, to when the Brexit vote actually happens, to encounter this giant like bifurcation in history that requires a reorganization of the theory of prediction alongside the, you know, reorganization of the material basis for what's being predicted. And that if we want to avoid being blindsided the way neoliberalism and the left, et cetera, have been, that we have no choice but to think of acceleration as on our part as a broader field than just like, you know, colloquially like increasing speed. Just that.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of different things going on there, directions to go from. One of the things that I think I'll just, if I can just take 2 minutes of people's time, I tactically sort of bypassed it, but I think I should just mention it, is obviously when I was dissing this particular section of the MAP, it's because of this line where they say it's criticizing confuses speed with acceleration. And you know, this attempt to, I think that acceleration becomes very hazy and speed becomes over concrete and hyper objectified. And obviously, you know, the immediate thing I go to with that is the fact that for Deleuze and Guattari, speed is an intensive quantity. You know, it's like a speed or a temperature is their kind of way of introducing into introducing intensive quantities. They are heterogeneous. They, you know, it totally is not using speed in a way that makes sense coming out of that lineage at all. And it takes us into this then question about, well, what's this minimal sensible definition of acceleration? And the minimal sensible definition of acceleration that everyone accepts as completely uncontroversial is as let me just get it completely right. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Oh, I don't know how I've managed to lose this, but it's the second derivation of position, isn't it? Like velocity is the first derivative of position in time, and acceleration is the second derivative. So it's velocity subject to this process of non-linear self-complication in a certain sense. It's already tending towards a kind of mode of non-linear thinking, and it's obviously that all the things that line up in terms of the invention, the simultaneous invention of the calculus by Newton and Leibniz, is because history was demanding the calculus arise at this point because of the fact that you're entering the epoch of acceleration, and acceleration needs a kind of rigorous mathematical definition, and that definition is going to be quantitative in order to make it techno-scientific, and it's completely, I think, inadequate to treat that quantification of acceleration as if it somehow holds it on the side of objectivity as a pre-critical illusion, which is the kind of is the implicit move that the MAP is making about that there's something inherently philosophically inadequate about intensive quantities. But the other thing, very quickly to say about or respond about what you think, which maybe is more in tune with what you're saying, is this thing about these intensifying flows. And the two examples, you know, the accelerating process of various types of ecological transformation, the accelerating flows of migration. And I think it seems to me to be notable and also heavily ironic and goes weirdly non-linear, that the people who primarily criticize one particular dimension of modernistic acceleration do seem to have systematically an implicit diagram that is saying, oh, but that accelerating process is actually self-canceling. You know, so that, for instance, the ecological people, in saying, they're always saying, when they say, look, this is terrible, what's happening, they're saying this can't go on, aren't they? You know, that if you have this process of ecological change, it's going to undermine the foundations of economic life. It's going to undermine the very foundations of the economic and technological and social process that is making it happening in some drastic fashion. Like, I think in their minds, like the amplifier feedback that leads to the system actually exploding or becoming dysfunctional. And I think it's just the same on the right with the whole question about migration flows, that what's being said, I think implicitly in those arguments, is also it's a self-canceling process. I think if they thought that it was actually a fundamental acceleration, that these flows of migration were actually self-propelling and self-propagating and strengthening and intensifying the modernistic process, it would look very different, the critique that is being made. But I think the critique that's being made is that the kind of socio-technological and economic foundations of societies that are involved in these extreme accelerating demographic flows are being undermined by them, and so they're not a self-sustaining process.
It almost seems like you know, one could thread the needle by you know, and even synthesize those two perspectives by kind of considering the relevant range against kind of what you're graphing as acceleration, i.e., you know, and this is something I struggle with in general in thinking about it, but when we're talking about an exponential growth curve,
right?
If you have any kind of materialist conception, you know, of the universe, atoms, bits and bytes, exponential growth, I mean, it simply can't continue. There's literally not enough atoms, combinations, whatever in the universe.
Right.
So, I mean, at some point you do need to truncate it, and maybe that's just where they're coming in. They're saying, you know, these processes
Yes.
constrained at some point.
Yes. I think that's kind of tautologically true at the mathematical level, which of course we should never leave behind. But it's very easy, again, to do what is not only analogous to, but it's perhaps strictly a pre-critical error, and think that you have an objective image of the limit of the process under consideration. So, for instance, you know, one example might be to say, within the plausible bounds of the system considered, there's only a certain amount of matter available, and leave out of the equation the possibility of the system as it exponentially grows, abstracting itself to the degree that it could miniaturize in certain radical ways, that it could go nanotechnological and femtotechnological, or in various other ways, you know, abstract itself beyond the limiting frame, that it obviously not indefinitely, or when I say obviously, I'm happy to accept not indefinitely, but certainly way beyond the horizon that is being sketched out for it originally. Like, for instance, a topical example of this, obviously, the peak oil phenomenon, isn't it? Where, of course, it's tautologically true that fossil fuels are a finite resource. There must be peak fossil fuel consumption. But you get into this zone of a kind of metaphysical construction of that when you become overly objectified on what actually you're talking about the resource in question, and leave out the, you know, leave out therefore all possible kinds of technological boundary expansions of that system. So, you know, I know it's a heated topic, and I'm not wanting to make a dogmatic claim one way or the other on the way this is working out, but the whole fracking thing has obviously sort of radically expanded what people had assumed was the relevant horizon of system expansion for fossil fuel consumption. And so, you know, if your reading of peak oil had very firmly ruled out the possibility that it was going to expand beyond relatively easy accessible liquid hydrocarbon deposits, then you would have been sideswiped by that. And I think that kind of sideswiping is not trivial.
I mean, it seems to Greer's entire paradigm, I haven't seen it mentioned anywhere at least,
Yeah.
but it kind of ignores the feedback aspect of the price system. You know, scarcity is kind of introduced.
Yes.
Prices regulate that.
Definitely, that's one element. And he also is quite explicitly resistant to radical technological solutions. So, you know, it's almost a mantra for him, you know, no fusion power, no space travel, no artificial intelligence, without an argument that can possibly exist in principle. It's an argument that I think he's very dependent on, because he wants to be able to draw relatively constrictive boundaries around, you know, for the horizon of this exponential process, and allowing for those kind of extreme technological breakthroughs would just expand the horizon of it to such an extent that it becomes historically unpredictable. But it's a really key question, of course. And if you turn to the other side of the, you know, someone like Kurzweil, who just has no sense of a boundary at all for his model. Like, he thinks that we've been on an exponential curve since the Big Bang, and that law of accelerating returns is the fundamental law. So what's his, you know, he gets very theological when he kind of responds to your sort of question, doesn't he? That, you know, you meet Jesus at a certain point or something like that, basically.
So I wanted to re-raise the specter of capital's self-propagation that you talked about, this other specter in Marx, and just maybe put some material on the table rather than pose a question, see how it relates. So the movement from the vector of MCM to MM is what I'm particularly interested in. because I think it was Vincent last week had put on the table chapter 15 from Capital 3, the development of the law's internal contradictions, where Marx talks about the rate of profit as the spur of capitalist production and valuation of capital as being its sole purpose. So I was wondering if I could just read a half page or a page from Capital. I think it's a really beautiful passage that addresses this, if that's all right with people.
Of course, I'm certainly would be thrilled.
So this is chapter 24. Interest-bearing capital is the superficial form of the capital relation, if you have it. So he says, in interest-bearing capital, the capital relationship reaches its most superficial and fetishized form. Here we have MM, money that produces more money, self-valorizing value, without the process that mediates the two extremes. In commercial capital, MCM, at least the general form of the capitalist movement is present, even though this takes place only in the circulation sphere, so that profit appears as merely profit upon alienation. But for all that, it presents itself as the product of a social relation, not the product of the mere thing. The form of commercial capital still exhibits a process, the unity of opposing phases, a movement that breaks down into two opposite procedures, the purchase and sale of commodities. This is obliterated in MM, the form of interest-bearing capital. So I just want to pick up, he moves right to the vector MM,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Here we have the original MM. Here we have the original starting point of capital, money, in the formula MCM reduced to the two extremes MM, where M equals M plus delta M, money that creates more money. This is the original and general formula for capital reduced to a meaningless abbreviation. It is capital in its finished form, the unity of the production and circulation process, and hence capital yielding a definite surplus value in a specific period of time. In the form of interest-bearing capital, capital appears immediately in this form, unmediated by the production and circulation processes. Capital appears as a mysterious and self-creating source of interest of its own increase. The thing, money, commodity value, is now already capital simply as a thing. The result of the overall reproduction process appears as a property devolving on a thing in itself. Yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
Self-valorizing value.
No, it's an excellent, fascinating passage for sure. Yeah, definitely.
So, like I said, no question. I just wanted to put this sort of on the table as a...
Yes. No, it's great. It's really fascinating. I mean, I think, can I just, two very quick responses to that passage, because one interesting question is about how substantive he's seeing that as being. Like, is it that he's saying this sort of almost short circuit of self-reflection of capital, immediate self-cultivation of capital is something substantial, or is he saying it's an analytical mirage that can appear in the perception of capital that is actually, you know, a kind of a mystified apprehension? Because obviously, well, it's intriguing if you try to be concrete about what that process is, because the language of the high-level financial services industries that would get closest to actually manifesting this, almost it would be fascinating to put their brochures against that passage, because they talk about products and assets in the most concrete sense. So I mean, they would never say anything like, you know, M to M delta. It's always, you know, we produce a financial product which we provide to our client, and, you know, there's the full circuit of exchange with these abstract products and services that complete this circuit that is strictly analogous to the circulation through the concrete commodity. So sorry, I in turn don't really know what I'm saying about that. I think it's an excellent passage, and it opens up some very germane questions. don't let me hog this. I mean, if other people have a response they'd like to make.
One interesting tie-in might be Thomas Piketty's kind of research, a few years ago, whereby he claims, R is greater than G, in relation to, M squared, M times M. And one of, I think, probably the most solid criticisms of his work that I've seen is the fact that, over time, capital has not accumulated at that exponential rate in anyone in particular's hands, i.e., via destruction in wars or some other kind of feedback. It's not been allowed to snowball kind of in that way. And I'm not exactly sure the point I'm making. I just sprung to mind.
No, but it's extremely relevant. It's extremely relevant. And it is, again, to do with the transcendental empirical difference between, in Marxist language, capital and capitals, isn't it? Like, for any particular capital, which is obviously because it's graphic and concrete and objective, it's the thing that triggers the most social concern, which requires sort of a cognitive effort to generalize into this systemic critique, then it is subject to all kinds of processes of concrete limitation that can't be applied to the system as a whole. So that, I think, and again, I don't want to be dogmatic about this because it's a relevant empirical fact and it's not something to dogmatize about, but I think it's certainly the case that in terms of companies, there is the process of systemic acceleration is accompanied by a compression of average corporate lifetimes. So if you kind of go back in history over, say, the American S&P 500, the amount of time that any particular company would remain as one of the top 500 companies in the United States is steadily shrinking. So it's a kind of there's a weird process of inversion happening, that as systemic capitalism intensifies, the lifespan or the ability to continually preserve an exponential process of accumulation for any particular capital is being steadily squeezed. So yeah, I think that is connected, isn't it, with your point and with the whole Piketty discussion too.
Well, I think also this passage ties into something that I've been interested in Marx, which I've spoken about to you before, Nick, this idea of capital taking over from capitalism. Because at the end of this chapter, he says that the problem is that this kind of automated process, and he says it's a kind of inherent secret power as an automaton of creating surplus value in geometrical progression. It is a kind of geometrical progression, but the only problem is that it's not creating surplus value, because of course Marx's theory of labor theory of value, is this idea that only living labor can create value.
Right.
So the fact that capital is becoming more automatic, becoming more kind of concentrated in the dead labor side of things, means that less surplus value is being created, even though it is a kind of exponential process. So what happens is capital takes over from capitalism because surplus value isn't being generated, even though something is.
Yes. No, I think this gets to a really deep issue that tends to get muddied because these arguments, of course, are so ideologically intense that it tends to be very distracting and put everyone into a kind of ADHD on it. But there's obviously a certain sense where the whole apparatus of the labor theory of value is an accounting protocol. So, you can consistently allocate productivity across the labor supply of necessity. It's kind of just a mathematical operation that's taking place. And the sort of suggestion that maybe there's something a bit weird about that operation comes in, like, Jehu had this whole series of interesting tweets about this issue where he's talking about the density of labor. And so, you can have a declining labor time and increasing density of labor, meaning, or intensity, he uses both words, I think, because of the fact that as capital becomes technologically intensified, the productivity of labor associated with that machinery is automatically increased. And so, so it's quite possible for the same worker to go to work, one day and the next, and there's been some technological upgrading has happened in the apparatus involved in their production process, and suddenly the intensity of their labor and their production of surplus value and the rate of exploitation and all of these accounting dimensions of what's happening to them economically have been totally transformed, just because the fact that they're now interacting with another machine, and maybe that other machine is hidden behind an interface so that they're doing exactly the same thing that they were doing before, but they're now doing it within a kind of expanded, complicated technological circuit that means that their actual productivity has been completely transformed. So, of course, as an accounting procedure, it doesn't change anything. You still say, you just take the aggregate production, subtract fixed capital depreciation, and distribute the remainder across the labor force. But it's obviously at this point very hard to see what is being tracked in terms of a real process or a real event, and it does seem to be just a kind of convention that is being employed rather than anything more penetrating. Sorry, Derek, are you wanting to get in there? Yeah.
So I just wanted to give a time check too, that we're 10 minutes till the end of class, but I'm happy to run longer if people would like to, and if Nick is up for that too.
Right. Yes. Let's just see whether people have still, how much warmth they've still got.
Okay.
Well, there was one thing I wanted briefly to kind of throw in here, which I know we could talk about forever, but Nick, you give a really interesting definition of accelerationism in teleoplexy as the critique of the primacy of the secondary. And I was wondering if you could expand on that here.
Yes. Well, this takes us back. I don't know. I probably will inevitably lead to a kind of simple-minded reconstruction, but I think it goes back to the stuff we've been talking about today, in terms of these two basic feedback loops of explosive loops and traps, and obviously there was a certain kind of transcendental necessity that compensation is actually the secondary process. You can't I'm sorry, I've got to avoid trying to put it into naive temporal terms. I will put it in naive temporal terms with an ironical warning that it's in naive temporal terms. But a control loop, a system of capture, a compensated system has to be produced, and it can't produce itself. It can only capture something or stabilize something. What it captures has to have come out of a more primary runaway drift dynamic. That's to say, the absolute deterritorialization is always primary in relation to relative deterritorialization, if we're using kind of Deleuze-Guattari language. But equally inevitably, the stabilized system becomes the foundation upon which any imaginable subjectivity is going to be initially constructed. So it's always that there is a kind of cosmic production of this metaphysical illusion that always, of necessity, positions the process of absolute deterritorialization as the anomalous derivative situation, and the cosmically derivative, cosmically secondary, cosmically produced situation of the stabilized, captured, reciprocated system as the fundament. And I think this is something that is very trans-partisan and trans-ideological, in the sense that I think, you know, what I think I call, I'm going to forget my own vocabulary at this point, but you see in the left, we see in left and right critiques of disruptive modernism, that's to say uncompensated historical transformation, exactly the same patterns, you know, at the fundamental systemic cybernetic level of diagramming what's happening and turning it into a kind of social criticism. It's exactly the same whether you go you go to kind of a certain kind of right-wing traditionalism, or you go to a kind of equal sort of aggrieved left humanism, that they both express the same resistance to uncompensated change from the position of a disrupted pseudo primordial situation or community. But I don't think I'm sorry. I know I'm not saying anything that is adding to what's there in that thing, probably. Yeah, I think in terms of like Theodore's question, which is about this, I think you have to say yes. No, sorry, absolute reterritorialization. I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question.
Because I guess what I'm trying to say is, on the one hand, we're saying like, oh, the telos of existence is absolute, pure deterritorialization, but that already has this sort of natural teleological direction. So it seems like the time agnostic would say, well, actually, the ripples converge upon this stone. It's towards absolute reterritorialization.
I would
sorry, not the time agnostic, the other perspective. Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry.
No, it's good. I would turn that a little bit inside out, I think, Theodore, and say, you know, that if you are expressing a tendency to absolute deterritorialization as if it were teleological, then you're totally right, and you're submitting it to a metaphysics of time, and it's completely one-sided, and you're therefore just on one side of a double pincer, and therefore you're in the strata. So the absolute deterritorialization can be no more teleological than it is mechanical. And I think this is what Deleuze and Guattari are constantly trying to do. You know, like there's a seemingly paradoxical notion, a desiring machine. Desiring machine is they're deliberately coupling a teleological and a mechanical term and just fusing them together, because because
Right.
you cannot privilege either the mechanical or teleological side of that without submitting to stratification or metaphysics.
Yeah, I think
Depend-
immediately. Sorry.
Yes. So I would just say, I would, it's kind of, has to be a mathematical transformation of what you're saying into what I'm saying, but because I'm just juggling the terms around to get rid of the problem that you quite rightly point to. And I would hold on to absolute deterritorialization, but insist upon the fact that a one-sidedly teleological or future-oriented description of that is stratic or metaphysical.
Yeah, there's that really interesting passage towards the end of Anti-Oedipus where they're talking about the Samuel Butler's what's it called, the Book on Machines or something.
Book of the Machines, yeah.
Book of the Machines, and they make the distinction between the vital forces and the mechanistic levers, and essentially they say, well, neither of these are sufficient in and of themselves. It's more, they give this it's almost compatibilist in a weird way, but I'm hesitant to say that because it's not doesn't fit as easily with notions of will.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure that's quite right either. I think it's because the thing with compatibilism is it sort of says you've got both,
Right.
doesn't it? And I don't think that they're saying there's actually a fully mechanical and a fully teleological process, and you can map them onto each other and something just tracks through both of them equally. I think they're saying that absolute deterritorialization is no more mechanical or no less mechanical than it is teleological, or the opposite. I mean, those two, the finalistic and original causation are products of the metaphysics of time. They're products of stratified perception. And so it's the diagonal line that cuts between them. I think diagonalization and compatibilism are not doing the same kind of philosophical work, I would say.
Right.
I'm afraid I haven't kept up with the sidebar at all. I'll have to peruse this. I'll have to peruse this later.
Yeah, the sidebar took off.
No, it's huge. The full sidebar of these things is like encyclopedic volume.
That image of the diagonalization too is, I think, really made clear in the passage that John read. Or no?
well, no, I'm not disagreeing, but I'm interested in why you say that.
Oh, I mean, I think you could easily make a little foursquare with the, say, the M in the bottom left quadrant and the M delta in a upper right quadrant, and just draw an arrow, right?
Right. It'd be good to see that filled in, actually. And what's in your two empty quadrants?
Yeah, that I'm less sure about. That's why it might just be the line rather than a diagonal. I'll think about it.
So does anyone have any points to make about the things that are, look, we haven't necessarily at all finished with the MAP. I mean, there's no reason why people can't talk about it in the future, but definitely broader questions about accelerationism, time, capitalism are going to be running forward. So does anyone have anything specific about the MAP that they think definitely needs to be tagged in right now? Or should we, what do people think about Derek has bailed. Do you think we should
I sort of
call a close?
I sort of wanted to say one more thing about left accelerationism, perhaps.
Yeah.
Oh, bye, Dark. And it sounds like what you're saying is that left accelerationism hasn't fully grasped the implications of accelerationism generally. To think that you can somehow direct the bus that has its pedal to the metal is just absurd. And then I guess this was what I was trying to get at last week about, well, the unconditional accelerationist perspective, fundamentalist accelerationism is it seems like a metaphysical commitment to make. And even though I know that you're arguing that it's the most critical commitment, I'm apprehensive to sort of put all my eggs in that basket just yet.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think there's two levels to that, at least. One of them is as a kind of an empirical argument about the extent to which the capitalism can be steered, and all kinds of, I think, not uninteresting questions about sort of what politics can do, how, what are resilient systems of incentive, the capacity of capitalism to root around certain kinds of intervention. All of these things come in on that level. But the more fundamental question is, I think, about time, which is to say, well, the formula that I'm using here, which I think is kind of germane, is that if you think that the future is less ontologically settled than the past, then you're not thinking time transcendentally, that you're caught within a metaphysics of time, because it simply cannot be that the nature of time is subdivided by time itself. Like things in time, of course, can be organized in terms of past, present, and future, and all of these time structures and durations and all of this thing. If you say, something like, how long does time last? Or it's even, you just go back to Kant's antinomies about, is time eternal or not? Kant just says, look, you can't ask that question. You're treating time as if it was an object. Time is a transcendental form of intuition. So you're engaged in metaphysics when you ask questions about time as if it were itself a thing in time. and treating the future as if it was just something that hasn't happened yet, that it's like that it has totally different, that time future is distinguished from time past in this absolutely fundamental way by its position in time, is exactly the same metaphysical error that Kant is dealing with in his antinomies. It's just simply a it's thoroughly critically diagnosed, and so it can't be something that one does without philosophical objection, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think as my understanding of Kant, though, is that that sort of agnosticism is almost, you can't hold that position very long, and Kant sort of he sort of like goes into a spiral of paranoid moralism.
Yes,
and that's I mean, the late Kant is incredibly rigid moral structures that are developing.
right.
And like, if you don't see Christianity in those later structures, I think you're just ignoring them. But not you specifically, but any reader.
No, totally, yes, totally. Yeah.
But I'm not sure. Yeah, so I'm not sure that it seems like an either or argument. You can't have the agnosticism. You either have the sort of, I want to say, like the Nietzscheanism or the Hegelianism.
Well, look, I don't think it's any coincidence, this whole language of schizophrenia that Deleuze and Guattari use.
Totally.
I think that it's probably absolutely right to say the only rigorous critical thinking is impossible in that sense. It is psychotic, and as stratified beings always revert to metaphysics, which I think that's what fuels this whole sort of turbulent dynamic of kind of critique in the modern pomo sense. The fact that metaphysics will always reconstitute itself, you've never finished deconstructing it, all of that kind of turbulence, which is a kind of theoretical echo of this perpetual tumultuous creative destruction that's happening at the level of the socio-technological economic plane. But I think the fact that that's happening, and the fact that you can't, the Kant and capitalism have this incredibly tight relation precisely because they aren't fixably identifiable. If you try to fixably identify them, which of course anyone who positions themselves as their enemy has to do, the I would say, but probably just highly controversially, the inevitable result is eventually a kind of trauma that by their very nature they are constantly sort of emerge out of an extreme abstraction that escapes the objectification that you try to apply to them, and so every critique of concrete capitalism, everybody wants to critique capitalism as such, at least since Marx, of course, because you want to capture the whole beast. But you inevitably, just like reading Kant, or Kant reading himself, or constituting himself, you have an inadequate, ironized, concrete facsimile of the truly critical system. And the truly critical system, whether you're talking about the philosophical system of critique or the socio-economic system of capital accumulation, is always sufficiently remote through transcendental empirical difference from the concrete instantiation that it eludes the net that you try to throw over it. if that's still attached to your.
Yeah, I think it is. I'm trying to connect more limbs to it as well. I think my understanding of sort of the Nietzschean epistemological position is that it says, you can cash your epistemological check immediately. This is it. Like, that's the closest thing you get to the absolute. And the Hegelian position is, well, hold on to the epistemological market while we sort of, or hold on to your shares in the epistemological market. It's getting better or something.
Yes, I'm not. Oh, yeah.
I kind of wonder as well about how this maps onto Deleuze's argument that Nietzsche is the kind of Kant turned in on himself, the kind of radical conclusion of the Kantian critique.
Yes. No, I think that would definitely be something I would see as highly plausible. Highly plausible. With the same sort of patterns, like, there's the kind of, in a way, Baroque Deleuzian reading of eternal return as the eternal return of difference and all of that kind of thing. But I think there's just a much more just brutalistic, straightforward thing about eternal return, that it's an objectification of transcendental time circuitry, and when you try to say, well, what is that, what's this object, you end up with these kind of ironized, kind of inadequate images, like Deleuze obviously then ironizes the kind of the old mill wheel, these kind of sort of tedious and clearly inadequate sort of cosmological objects, mega objects. But I think that that doctrine that he clearly sees as the kind of final kind of capstone of his whole thinking is because he sees that transcendental time circuitry is a philosophical necessity. It has to be thought, and the fact that then it's imaged inadequately is a kind of secondary derivative effect. Okay, look, everyone's leaving.
Yes. Yeah. It looks like
I think we should. Yeah. So yeah. So I've missed the chance to say thanks to the people who've already gone, but thanks to those of you who are still here. And it was great. I hope I haven't rabbited on too much. I've probably been a bit over enthused.
This was great. So for next week, I just want to clarify. So next week, we're still in daylight savings times. So should we plan on meeting an hour earlier for Shanghai?
Yeah, that would be great. I'm sorry. I do apologize for that, and I will now. I now understand the whole thing, and I'll be on time.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm sorry that the syllabus is just appearing in these little bits. I'll try and slowly expand and get some more stuff in, so we're a few more weeks ahead with that.
Sounds perfect.
Okay.
Wait, yeah. Okay. What are we looking at next week?
Well, I thought we'd look at a whole bunch of kind of spin-off left accelerationist.
Okay, because I was confused as to what, also which piece from Mo you were talking about.
Oh, he said he was going to put it on the schoolroom. So if he hasn't, I'll make sure he does that, because he promised he'd do it. I'm sure he will. Last week he said he was going to do it. If it's not there now, I'll harass him about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds good. All right. Have a good week, everyone.
Yeah, it's definitely. Thanks, Theodore, for keeping things on the rails.
Yes, of course.
If they have stayed on the rails. Okay.
Right.
Great
Bye.
week, everyone. Bye.